I freeze being recorded.
Freezing. Are you recording now? All right.
Welcome to a mini Wander Learn podcast episode. I'm here with the co-founders of Winding Tree and Max and Pedro, and I wanted to have them address one of the comments that came in on my podcast regarding it. And the guy, he basically, I'll just read what he says. He said that if travelers are going to pay with these tokens, these Leaf tokens, what's in it for me, traveler? Why should I use tokens instead of cash or credit cards? Why should I care that the token carries data around? It's my data. I don't want others to have it. In this day of privacy concerns and the lashback against Facebook, it's stupidly out of touch to complain that airlines don't get all your data if you book through an intermediary. So he's got some other questions, but go ahead, Max and Pedro, how do you address that first basic issue?
So I was reading that comment on your website, and I think like you didn't read the whole thing. So
I want to just, he says lots of things. I just want to give you the chance to answer the first part first. Then we'll get to
I think he then summarizes it very, very nicely. Well, let me answer the first part. It's hard.
I guess I can take a whack at it. So this is one of the subjects that comes up a lot at data conferences and discussions about data privacy and so on, which is kind of like the Wild West. There's really no regulation around how data is used, right? And I remember at one of the events I was at where data miners were discussing this, they were discussing millennials and how millennials don't like being tracked, right? The issue, the conclusion they came to is not that millennials don't like being tracked. They actually give data freely to certain brands that are good at using that data, right? And as a result, they are pickier with how their data is tracked, and they want to know and see a correlation, a strong correlation between the data that's being tracked, that's being collected on them, and what they're getting in return, right? So if by tracking my data, you make my life so much easier and so much better, I don't mind you tracking everything about me, right? Or so much about me, right? The frustration or the pickiness with millennials is when all kinds of data is being collected, and then I still have to enter in a bunch of information when I'm buying something. I still have to make all these preferences over and over and over again. And that's where the frustration comes in. And I think it's because millennials are more educated around that. And so they want to know what their data is being used for. So back to the question, when you travel, a lot of data is being collected on you, but none of it is being used to benefit your travel, or very, very little of it relative to other industries. So that's why when we emphasize that travel companies need that data, it's actually quite powerful for the traveler, because who's servicing you at the end of the day? It's not an intermediary that provides backend software. It's the hotel that you're staying at. It's the airline you're flying with, or it's the actual website where you're buying that travel. It's more important at those two ends than it is in the middle, yet most of it is being bottlenecked in the middle. And that's where the disconnect happens. And that's why it's important for suppliers, hotels and airlines, to have that data so they can service you better. Can you imagine you show up and instead of the hotel asking you, hey, is this the first time you're staying with us? And you're like, no, I've actually stayed here 100 times. Or, like they would actually have very specific information and they can service you better. Because that is being collected anyways. Somebody knows that you've stayed there 100 times. It's just not somebody who you're facing.
How about his question about the Leaf tokens? Why should you use these tokens instead of my credit card or cash?
So I want to answer, kind of the same question, but on a different level. So today we had, with Pedro, we had a conversation about prime numbers, for example. I love math. And we had this discussion about how we use prime numbers all the time. In encryption, right now we have this video call and algorithms that use prime numbers are used in this communication. But they were discovered hundreds of years ago. And for hundreds of years, they had absolutely no use, right? So for maybe 16 people, mathematicians, they loved playing with them. But in real life, they have absolutely no use, right? But today, we use them all the time. And what I'm trying to say here is that what we're building here at Winding Tree is all sorts of different building blocks. Tokens that carry data is not necessarily something that customers or hotels will have to deal with, right? It will be one of the building blocks that will carry information from one place to another in an interesting way. And we're exploring a variety of different ways how to do that and why to do that. And our project is about creating those building blocks and showing it to engineers. And at our hackathon that happened, 2-3 weeks ago, we had about how many? 80 to 100 people or so, engineers from travel companies who came to our event to learn about those building blocks. And then we had about 12 different projects built using those building blocks, including the token, including the infrastructure that we have. And the value of all these things that we're doing here is kind of, the guy in the comment, unfortunately, I don't remember his name, he says, Colin, what's in it for me? What's in it for the small guy right now? Why would I use Winding Tree, right? And I understand that as a small hotelier, perhaps they don't want to and they don't have resources to participate in what I call here is fundamental science, right? So those prime numbers, that was fundamental science. There is no real use. And today we have, Large Hadron Collider that, smashes particles together at huge energies, and there's no real use to that stuff. A bunch of geeks in France and Switzerland, they're just running around and, discussing all those things. And that's about it. That's a few hundred people around the world that are interested in that stuff. Why me? Why a small guy would want to participate in that research? Perhaps not. But there's a lot of value in that science, in learning about things. And perhaps in the future, in 10, 20, maybe 100 years, there will be huge breakthroughs because of that science that we're doing today. And here, we talk to a lot of travel companies, and we do have this dichotomy all the time, short-term versus long-term. Some companies come to us and say, well, it's fun and games what you're doing, but how can I benefit right now? And our answers vary in complexity. One of the answers is, well, we're building something like a network of travel companies, right? Right now, when you join, you will be company number maybe 3 or 5, right? There's not a lot of value in a network in the internet where there's only 5 companies, right? But definitely there is no value at all when there is only one company that's in the network. And that's why we need hundreds of companies to collaborate together, to work together, to create a network that will actually have network effects, right? That will happen over time, right?
So let me see if I understand. Maybe Pedro, you can clarify. So to answer his question about the credit card and his cash, the average customer is not going to pay with Leaf tokens.
Not necessarily. They could elect an option to pay with Leaf tokens, theoretically.
Okay.
But it's not practical.
It's not scalable right now.
Yeah. Forcing crypto at the forefront of the consumer level is not practical today. It's fun for like hackathons that are a crypto crowd. For example, we did one in Berlin where we allowed the hotel to accept Lyft tokens for payment, and it was significantly cheaper, right? But it was also significantly more complex to book that hotel room because of the nature of crypto. It's just clunky today, right?
And Colin is right. I think he mentioned also, he touched on the complexity of owning those tokens, right? So an average consumer today won't be able to do that. They wouldn't have the time, the resources to educate themselves about all those things. It will be the future. Again, it's with every new technology, let's say we're transitioning from punch cards to some sort of magnetic discs. The questions were absolutely the same. Why would I do that if everyone uses punch cards? And what would be the benefit for me to use those new fancy magnetic discs or tapes if no one else is using it? But of course, technology progresses all the time, and it will happen gradually over time. The transition will happen. Today, we're still in early stages of the blockchain technology.
Okay. Now he goes on and he goes off on a little bit on a tangent. He talks about, he says, how does this simplify technology matters for the little guy, the folks on the ground trying to give tours around their country? He says, Google lets them sell AdWords to the world. Airbnb lets them host their houses worldwide, and yet Winding Tree's busy crapping on Google. Give me a break. I don't understand what he really means by that, but maybe you do.
Right. So I think that happened in the travel industry several times. The little guys, sometimes not so little, hotels, by saying that we are not interested in the technology, they basically outsource the technology research to other companies, right? So they said someone else will do that for us, basically, right? We don't have the resources, we don't have time to educate ourselves about technology. So, and that's why those companies like Priceline and Expedia came to be, because they actually did invest in the technology, and now they're collecting rent. Right. So I think the math here is simple, if you will, right? We live in a world that is run by technology. We live in a technological world. By saying, no, I don't want to do anything about technology is like saying, I don't want to drive. I don't want to learn how to drive. But the world is scarce, especially here in the United States, right? If you don't know how to drive, it could be more complicated. I guess you can survive still, right? My point is, if we don't do that, someone else will invest in the technology and someone else will become the intermediary. And again, perhaps Colin is not aware of what's going on in the travel industry, on the airline side, on the hotel side of things, but there are companies, very few companies, that both hotels and airlines are very frustrated with. Just about a week ago, there was a piece of news about Sabre acquiring Fair Lodgings. And it just shows me how the industry is still striving for centralization. And a lot of airlines are concerned about this centralization because, of course, a monopoly, well, let's say there are 2 or 3 companies right now out there that can perform certain tasks in the airline industry or in the hotel industry. It's not just one, but still there's a huge amount of centralization, and those companies, they do abuse their power. And I wrote about it extensively. Maybe Colin could go onto my LinkedIn profile. There are a few articles about that over there. And we know that. We did our research and we talked to the hotels, we talked to the airlines, and a lot of people, the majority of the people that we talked to, in fact, are concerned about those companies in the airline industry, in the hotel industry, and they're concerned about Google. Because Google, being a very large company, very tech savvy, one of the most advanced companies in the world in terms of technology. And guess why they're so big and so hugely profitable? And it's one of the biggest companies in the world. Why? Because they did care about technology, as well as Apple, as well as companies like Facebook, et cetera, right?
No, hold on. Let me get to his last point, and then I have one other question. But
yeah.
Pedro, you live in Texas, and there they have oil. And Colin is saying this whole thing, this Winding Tree, and probably I imagine also cryptocurrencies for that matter, he's just going to throw in everything, or even blockchain for that matter, is snake oil. In other words, it's just a story. There's no real meat behind this. It's just a fad, and it's all going to pass away. And so when people say, hey, Winding Tree is a snake oil, you guys are all snake oil stuff, how do you respond to that? Because obviously for the average consumer, they don't see any real progress. They don't see how this is going to change or disrupt anything on a practical level. Pedro, how do you respond to that?
I think the shortest response is a saying that our CTO and our developers throw around a lot in the office at Winding Tree is talk is cheap, show me the code. And this is something that we've been emphasizing because in travel, blockchain is entering, just like in almost any other industry today, there's a lot of blockchain projects. There's a lot of companies doing private blockchain projects with consultants from big tech companies and so on. And so that question is thrown around a lot, like, what are we actually doing with blockchain? And one of the things that we've been educating people around is the importance of open source, right? If snake oil is only possible if nobody knows where that oil is and nobody has access to it, right? But all of our code is openly available. And everything we do is publicly available. For example, you asked about recording the discussion today when we hopped on the call, and we said, sure, we have no qualms about sharing to the world. And I think that that's the way it should be. I think that if a blockchain project is not open source, it isn't serious, in my opinion. And that's something we've gone to great lengths to show and make everything available. And the hackathon, for example, that was one of the really cool things about it, was all of those 11 or 12 projects, they were all contributing open source code that is going to be available to the industry. And I think that's beautiful. That's the way we should be going if we want to compete. Or look, the vision is for folks to eventually use travel as the measuring stick the way that they do today about Amazon. They say, we want to be the Amazon of X, right? What about the days when we can use travel as a reference point for advanced technology, which it isn't today by any stretch of the imagination, but it was ahead of a lot of other industries back when it started, when airlines first started booming. We had a huge head start, travel industry. And I think that there's another opportunity now with what we're doing with open source code and uniting around solving industry technological problems.
Fair enough. Oh, sorry.
It's a great analogy. Yeah.
Okay.
I think if you know the ingredients of the snake oil and you know what they do, and we provide all the tools for learning about snake oil, right?
By the way, you're also non-profit. That's another thing. Most snake oil people are for-profit industries by definition.
Correct. Absolutely. Yes. So we are a nonprofit foundation, and our goal is to just, to me, it's introducing fundamental science in the travel industry, because no one does it. Like, everyone is concerned about their short term. What do we do to, increase the share price or, ROI for investors or companies? How about long term? Well, people, unfortunately, in the travel industry, I think, tend to forget about long term. They're too concerned with the short term profit. Sometimes understandably so, especially for, again, we're talking about little guys. But big companies that have a lot of resources, that have some leeway, and there are some big and profitable companies in the travel industry, I think they're not up to the task at all. Unfortunately, there is very little fundamental science that's done there. So we're trying to change that.
Okay, and then now the last comment. This came in from Gary Arndt, who's a very famous travel blogger. He wrote on my Facebook page as a comment regarding the Winding Tree initial podcast that we did. He says, I am willing to bet money that Winding Tree does not disrupt the travel industry or any other, or actually he's talking about not just Winding Tree, blockchain technology will not disrupt the travel industry or any other industry for that matter. So he's just making a blanket statement about blockchain, a grand skepticism about blockchain.
Right. So what was it? When Thomas Edison was presenting his invention, the light bulb, to some committee in England, they said, there is no practical application of this technology for a sane person, right? Of course, there are hundreds of those people that say those things about all sorts of different technologies, not maybe just blockchain, right? And to me, it's either irrelevant to say those things, because if that technology doesn't change anything, like, why muse about it? Or you're wrong. I don't know why discuss so to me, what is innovation? Innovation is trying out as many things as possible, things, of course, that make sense. And the blockchain makes a lot of sense to a lot of very, very smart people around the world.
Hold on, Max. I think what he's trying to get at is maybe there might be some back-end changes. I'm putting words in Gary's mouth here, but might be thinking that, okay, fine, it might change the back-end databases and that kind of stuff, but from the customer's perspective, the travel industry on a practical level won't be changed at all. I'm still going to play with my Visa MasterCard or my debit card. I'm still going to log on the internet. I don't know. Nothing really. Paris is still Paris. So
my point is, I would highly recommend for those people that tend to just throw those blank statements, and to people who make reasonable comments, like Colin, he's asking and he's trying to learn. I definitely understand where he's coming from. To actually try and learn something about the blockchain, to read some of the blogs, look up maybe some of our talks, some articles that we wrote. We reference a lot of smart people, very, very smart people. Nassim Taleb, who wrote a bunch of best-selling books about economy, about technology, about all sorts of things. He believes that blockchain will change a lot of things.
Right, but there's also, I think, Warren Buffett. I could be wrong if I might be misquoting him, but there's definitely smart people on the other side of the fence who are saying, cryptocurrencies, for example, is not going to go anywhere. It's a danger to society. It's an environmental disaster, and there are people saying that as well.
Right.
No. My opinion is, I don't think any of us can say whether it will disrupt or not, and I think it would be wrong to say that it will 100% or that it won't 100%.
Yeah.
And I think it goes back to talk is cheap, show me the code. And I think until product is being used and saving for companies in the industry, it'll always just be a big question mark, and we could talk about it all day. But ultimately, what's going to disrupt or change anything is the code. And the important thing is that we're trying. It's an experiment, and we're changing the industry by providing this open source environment. And even if we fail, the fact that we tried and opened up this Pandora's box of ideas around open source, and even changed the way a lot of the big players in the space look at the technology and approach working with technology partners, I think will still be a powerful gain, and we'll have proven that assumption wrong, right? But I think it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try. Right. Because it is technology that, contrary, like you mentioned, Warren Buffett, there's a lot of crap going around in either direction. Like, if Bitcoin doesn't go to 500,000 by X year, I will do X, and others saying that it's a total scam. But for me, what catches my attention is not so much that the Trump-like tweets and so on. It's more of the sheer immensity of the developer community around it. This is not, just a couple of developers and then a bunch of investors talking. It's actually mostly developers and then some disconnected investors trying to sound like oracles, right? Which for me is quite fascinating. It's very different than a lot of other industries. In most industries, you have a couple of actual tech folk and then a ton of hype. But we don't look at it that way. We see, blockchain has hype. But if you look at the amount of hype talkers relative to the coders, it's much more code heavy than almost any other space. Like the price, for example, going down all the time and everyone freaking out about it is kind of funny when you consider that technology keeps growing by leaps and bounds. Yeah. If you're at DevCon and you see the amount of folks there, it was interesting at the hackathon, we had guys from ATP Co, which do pricing for airlines and so on. They were saying it was the first time they had, of course, heard about blockchain a lot. But they said until they actually sat down at our hackathon, and there were people from Swarm there, from Ethereum name service. It was quite a brilliant blockchain crowd, and they were sitting down together and pulling them into their project, saying, "Hey, can you help me with this? Can you help me with that?" And they actually used Swarm for their project. And they said, "I didn't even know. Theoretically I knew, but I didn't get my hands dirty until today." And that's what it's all about. It's about actually trying the technology and working with technology, and I think talking less and coding more.
Yeah, and to me, it also boils down to experimentation. That's what innovation is to me. And we could talk about what is good, what is bad, what should work, what shouldn't work. But at the end of the day, is just building things and trying them out. And that's what entrepreneurship is about. That's what science is about. In science, we never say like, okay, here's the thing. We 100% sure that this is the truth, right? No, it's not about that.
It's also science doesn't look at things and say, how can we make money off of this immediately? It's just like, they just want to first understand, how does this work? Can it do something, anything? And then the whether it has a practical application is something that science doesn't really worry about initially.
Right, and the problem, I think, is that there is a learning curve. You know, you try and learn about Bitcoin and blockchain, and you immediately sucked into this whole of consensus algorithms and proof of work and cryptography. And I understand that for a lot of people, they just give up, right? They're like, okay, no, this is too hard, and then they make those blank statements. Okay, this is not rocket science. If you dig a little deeper, you don't have to go very far. You dig a little deeper, and a lot of those things make sense.
Okay, so we'll have to come up with a new term called blockchain science. It's not rocket science, it's blockchain science. It's like
kind of like in between, in the middle.
Complexity.
Right. I could send you a few links maybe after this call. I could send you a few links to articles where serious scientists and serious scholars are discussing those things, and they're discussing the implications of this technology on the society, on how people communicate, on how economies work, or how economies will change because of this technology. And it's already our world has changed because of Bitcoin, because of blockchain. You know, now we have Ethereum, now we have all this interesting developments in game theory and a variety of different topics.
But I think also,
I like how Andreas Antonopoulos said that because of blockchain, because of Bitcoin, we've seen in the past 10 years the biggest deployment of civilian public key cryptography. No one cared about public key cryptography 10 years ago. Now, a lot of people know what a public key is, what a private key is, how they're used in cryptography and communication.
Also a surge in the interest in economics and incentives and valuations,
game
fiat
theory,
currency, game theory, all of that has been surging through the roof.
Yeah, no, and by the way, I guess the last thing that we should end on, I think the last thing is what Pedro says. We should stop talking and we just start acting. That was a great thing. But before we stop talking, I also think it's a question of expectations. In other words, when some people hear disruption, they imagine complete, utter revolution on every scale. Like all of a sudden, it's going to be free to go to Paris, and that everybody can go to Paris. For them, or like I have to just think that I want to go to Tokyo, and all of a sudden everything will happen. So there's different levels of disruption, and maybe the thing that people at Winding Tree and just in general in the blockchain space is to set a level expectation that it is revolutionary, but to a limit. It's going to change the travel industry. It's going to disrupt things, but not to some fantasy limit that maybe some people are thinking when they hear disruption.
Yeah, and I think also expectations, they have the time component there. So people think that that's going to happen tomorrow. And so maybe we should rephrase that Winding Tree will disrupt the industry, but that process will take about 10, 20 years, right?
Yeah.
I think also, like to the point about the credit cards and everything, if you look at any of the really disruptive technologies when they came about, whether it's the internet or whether it was cars, the implications weren't just, I can get from A to B. It was, I can get fresh produce so much faster, delivery, like everything changed. It wasn't just getting from point A to point B. Society changed as a whole. And I think if you look at the travel industry, there's kind of like we're at a bottleneck. We're stuck technologically. And our aim is to break up that bottleneck. And that's why disruption is used a lot, is to finally allow for that innovation from the grassroots, because that doesn't happen today. Making that inventory and data available to, the data available to suppliers so they can actually personalize more, and making inventory available to startups so they can actually start playing around and building tools without having to gain permission, is a pretty big change. It means grassroots innovation, and what those innovators and startups and big companies will do with that openness is yet to be determined. But the implications could be huge.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, go ahead. So hold on one second, Max. I just want to say that I think it's similar building up the HTTP, protocols and building up the infrastructure for the internet. The people who laid out the foundations, those early days of the internet, had absolutely no clue that Facebook was. They could have never ever in a million years predicted that Twitter would exist, or that you'd be able to do some, have this, maybe even this video conference that we're doing and recording, whatever.
Yeah.
So many things happen in the internet that the inventors of the infrastructure could never have envisioned. And I think when Winding Tree talks about disruption and that kind of stuff and innovation, you guys have no clue. You who are helping create this stuff have no frigging clue what might actually be offered in 5-10 years. But you just know that probably something will happen.
Absolutely. So first of all, I think it's a really ungrateful task, try to predict the future. It's like there are so many different versions of the future that with a very good probability going to be off by a lot, right? And again, we talked about Thomas Edison. We can talk about the Mercedes, and they said back in the day when they were just starting that they predicted that there will never be more than 1 million personal cars around the globe because it's never going to be a massive scale. The Wright brothers, they never thought, they said, no, this technology, flying from point A to point B, will never be a massive technology. It's just going to be a toy. They never thought.
How about Thomas Watson, the co-founder or the founder of IBM? He said the world market for computers is less than 5 or something like that. Yeah. Well, so experts in their industries never thought that their industries will be larger than a certain number. It just doesn't make any sense. And I agree with you. And that's why I agree with you that we don't know and we don't want to know. It's not our business to try and predict what kind of things people will be building on top of the technology that we're creating, because we can't. And all we can do today is just to create that stuff and see what's going to happen. One of my favorite mathematical concepts is Conway's game of life, right? So look it up, guys, whoever is watching this video. It's Conway's game of life. It's a game, right, that has 4 simple rules. But based on that 4 simple rules, tremendous complexity can be built. I don't know how to illustrate it right now because it's complex, but look it up. It's amazing. And so today all we can do is just to build those things and not distract ourselves with trying to predict the future. Last word, Pedro. Any last words before we cut?
No.
Okay. Show me the code.
Yeah, I think that's a good
word of wisdom. Okay, guys, thank you so much for your time. And for those who want to learn more, go to windingtree.com.